Hi, my name is Sabina Leonelli. I'm a professor of history and philosophy of science at the University of Exeter. And what I want to ask is, what can the history and the philosophy of science contribute to asking what I think is a crucial question at this time, which is, why has there been such a huge variation in political responses and decision-making given the evidence and the models that were produced to understand the spread of contagion due to the coronavirus? Now, I think, first of all, there's a big question around what do we mean by evidence here. And it's very difficult to know and to compare the ways in which different countries have produced even things as apparently straightforward as death counts, because different countries actually relate the coronavirus differently to underlying conditions. So in some places, they would have assumed that people who had underlying conditions, in fact, ended up dying of those conditions, and that death wouldn't be attributed directly to the coronavirus, while in other places, anybody who had underlying conditions but also tested positive for the virus and dies would be classified as a virus-related death. And this becomes even more complicated when trying to understand who is actually being tested and who should be tested. And again, information about this tends to vary enormously, because in some countries, like in the UK, testing is limited, or at least has been limited at the beginning of the epidemic, to people that had supposedly direct contact with somebody who had already tested positive. While in other countries, there's been a much more systematic approach to testing, such as, for instance, in South Korea. And that meant that the numbers of people that had been tested and were testing positive across countries didn't really mean much in a comparative sense, because those numbers were generated with very, very different criteria for who should be tested. Now, this means that the data that then went to feed different types of mathematical models that were supposed to predict what would happen with epidemics and where it would spread and how fast, tended to be of very different quality and of a very different nature. And very often we've seen in the history of science that once a model is produced that can absorb data, there is a tendency to just look at the results of the model and not to look anymore at the quality and the comparability and the consistency of the results of the data that actually are fed into the model. And unfortunately, this has happened in this instance very strongly, partly because this has been so rapid that it's been very difficult to coordinate an international scientific response to this. This despite the fact that there has been a lot of movement in relation to the open science movement in trying to bring these results together. Ultimately, what we've seen, I think, certainly when one looks at the reaction of the UK government, is a strong emphasis and a strong reliance on mathematical modelling, with much less emphasis on whether or not the evidence was to be trusted and whether the data were reliable. Also, we've seen a lack of contextualization of the mathematical models. And this is, of course, aggravated by the fact that whenever you want to contextualize the results of those models, you need to take account of the social situations in which they're going to be made sense of. So in this case, for instance, the big differences in socialization and in the health systems of the different countries. So what is the key challenge for me as an historian and philosopher of science in looking at this situation? Certainly is the fact that the process by which we have gathered all of these different types of evidence and then fed them into a political process has very often been less than transparent. And in a situation where evidence is being accumulated very fast, this is a big handicap, because one needs to be able to review constantly the procedures through which the data have been collected, they've been processed, and they actually have been inputted into the models. Otherwise, the models themselves become not so much unreliable, but just very difficult to interpret. So how does that illuminate a challenge for my field and for science in general? I think it really puts an emphasis on the importance of open research, not just as the sharing of results, but as the sharing of methods and procedures. And this is where philosophers and historians of science can really make a big contribution in keeping elucidating methods. And I wish all of us luck and continue to do this work. Thank you.